Welcome all of you, and thank you all very much for joining us. Can I put the first question, and can I ask each of you how helpful you think the cost of living support payments have been, and the arrangements for them have been, for the people that your organisation works with? Starting with Helen Barnard.
So I think if you look at last year, if you look at it overall, we saw the highest need ever for food banks. So we gave out 3 million food parcels. That was a 37% increase on the year before, more than 1 million for children for the first time. So if you look at it overall, even with every bit of support that was put in, we were still seeing a lot of people in really dire hardship. When you then look in our data at what happens every time each cost of living payment comes in, what you can see really clearly is they did definitely help. So when the first one came in July, we saw a dip of about 21% in terms of the need for our food banks compared to what we would have expected on the trend. Then the November one, we saw a dip of about 15% compared to what we would have expected in terms of the number of food parcels people needed. And in the most recent one that's just gone out in April, we saw a dip of 23%. So it clearly made a significant difference. But what you see is that was a very short respite. So the payments come out, people for between 1 and 3 weeks, you see that dip. Then the need shoots up again, and in each case, it went back up to, as it had been previously, a higher level of need than the year before. So in the most recent one that's gone out in April, we saw that dip. It didn't last very long. It lasted a shorter period of time than the others, but it shot up again. So in the first few weeks this year, we are already seeing levels of need higher than last year, which was itself significantly higher than the previous year. So I think that they clearly helped. They were delivered, they went in a targeted way to people who really needed them. They landed in people's bank accounts. You didn't have to apply. All that was good. But I think what it tells us is that one-off payments cannot respond to an ongoing level of income that's too low to cover the essentials. They can only ever give a short respite.
Thank you very much. Andy Rose.
We've seen a similar picture. I think for many people with a learning disability, the cost of living payments just haven't reflected the challenges that they've experienced. And we know that 80% of disabled people have said that they just haven't been enough to cover their increased costs. As an organisation, we've seen a consistent degree of need for our helpline for people with a learning disability, their families and carers. Anecdotally, we know that the cost of living payments have often either been swallowed up by one large payment of a disproportionately high energy bill, because we know people with a learning disability often have higher energy needs than non-disabled people, or the cost of living payments have been defrayed across the wide number of extra costs that disabled people have. We've also found that even when people have been in receipt of the general cost of living payment, the disability cost of living payment, and their full benefit entitlement, they have still had to make profoundly difficult choices about whether they can afford their essentials. So in our recent survey, we found that 26% of people with a learning disability who responded reported not turning the lights on, 35% reported skipping meals, and 38% had not used their heating when they were cold. So I think that just indicates that hardship for people with a learning disability has persisted, even with the cost of living payments.
Thank you. Morgan Wilde.
I'm going to add to the fairly bleak chorus from my colleagues here. So, just to give you a sense of context, we have had probably the bleakest start to the year as a service that we've ever seen. So we give advice on anything, but we roughly give advice on around 300 different topics. And for over 70 of those issues, we've broken all-time records this year. And when put that in the context of us having been around over 80 years, we started at the outset of World War II. It's really something to be in the bleakest situation for people's living standards we've ever seen. The cost of living payments have helped. We've seen a similar temporary dip for people coming to us to access crisis support. That's typically referrals to food banks like the Trussell Trust network, or charitable grants from local councils or other charities. You see that dip in the data for a month, and then it goes away. You don't see that dip for our other key advice areas. So, for example, if you come to us for a budgeting exercise in debt advice, we are increasingly seeing that our advisors, even when they're going through your income, through your expenditure with a fine-tooth comb, they can't make the numbers add up. Over 50% of people coming to us are now in that situation if we're giving them debt advice. It's really quite a bleak overall picture.
Thank you very much. Sally West.
Like others, I mean, the payments have made an important contribution, and I think particularly combined with the other support that the government has given with energy bills. But I think the evidence that we're getting, both from the polling that we do regularly and also from the many, many people that contact us, is that for some people it isn't sufficient. People are still struggling with bills. I mean, perhaps to sort of pick out two groups, a lot of people tell us that they've got health conditions or disabilities. They need to keep their house particularly warm. They've got high laundry bills, high costs of extra food and things. And people in those situations are kind of really, really worrying about. The fact that they over the winter they were turning down the heating and they knew it wasn't doing any good for their health. They knew it was being affected. A woman whose husband had got dementia saying, you know, and various other conditions, he doesn't understand why we can't have the house warm enough. I suppose the other group that seems to be coming to us increasingly are people who have a bit of savings or private pensions and thought that they had done enough to have a comfortable retirement, not luxurious, but get by and maybe have a bit over for a treat, maybe even save for a holiday, and are saying now, all my income is going on my regular outgoings. We got a private pension, we can't get any extra help, and they're drawing on savings. So I think people worried about getting by day to day. The weather's obviously getting warmer, so heating isn't such an issue, but they're still worried about the future. I read something from a woman in her 80s who said she's had to draw on her savings. She just about survived last winter, but she's really, really worried about next winter. So worrying about what's going to happen in the future as well.
Thank you very much. David Linden.
Thank you very much, Sir Stephen. Let's start with Ms West. Does targeting these cost of living payments to those already in receipt of benefits, those most in need of state support?
Well, I think targeting the sort of bulk of the help to people getting means-tested benefits obviously gets help to people who are in need by definition on a means-tested benefit because you have a low income. What we're finding is they don't reach everybody in need on a low income, and the two groups that we've particularly highlighted is those who should be getting pension credit because the people that we deal with, pension credit is the main passporting benefit for cost of living. So the people who are missing out because they haven't claimed pension credit, and I know this is an ongoing issue that the committee and other people have looked at, but take-up remains an important issue. And secondly, the people who are just over the pension credit level. And you could be £1, you could be 10p over the pension credit level, and that gives that cliff edge, whereas you don't get the support from the cost of living payment, 650, 900 in this year. And people can be worse off because they've got a small private pension than if they hadn't never saved for that and was claiming pension credit.
Ms Wild?
Yeah, so I just fully endorse what Sally has said about pension credit. I'd add two further issues for people who aren't being reached. One is people who happen to receive what's called a nil award in universal credits at the time for their eligibility for the cost of living payments. We've seen huge numbers of people in that situation who would typically be in any given month be receiving a universal credit.
Somebody who's been sanctioned, for example.
Exactly, somebody who's been sanctioned. We have seen cases where people are working part-time, they're receiving a universal credit payment, they cover a couple of shifts, that takes them just over the threshold, and because they're just over the threshold at the wrong point, it means that they aren't eligible for payment. It's been a huge issue, and people don't understand why they aren't receiving the support that they desperately need. The other issue has been people who are on non-income-based benefits, so things like housing benefit on the legacy system, contributory ESA and contributory JSA, who aren't receiving any other form of income-related benefits like universal credits. Those people haven't been eligible to take housing benefit, for example. That probably affects around 100,000 working age households, around 370,000 pensioner households, many of whom would be eligible for pension credits. We know that most people in that situation will be on a low income and may be eligible for income-related benefits if they had applied. I think it's worth reflecting on the contributory benefits specifically, because I think that does create a real unfairness that if you happen to have made sufficient national insurance contributions to qualify for something like contributory ESA, you will perhaps be in a worse position than somebody on an income-based benefit.
Ms. Rose?
Similar to Sally, really, we've found that vast numbers of people with a learning disability have been reached, quickly and efficiently through the cost of living payments, but we are concerned that it hasn't reached everybody. And we're particularly mindful of people with a learning disability who are in need but are missing out on cost of living payment support because they aren't already claiming benefits that they're entitled to because of barriers that they experience in the design and delivery of the welfare system. So that's a group that we're really, really concerned about.
Ms. Bernard?
So I think that you need to separate it into two different things. So using the social security system to target people, I think it's right. A lot of work went into designing a system which would make sure help gets to people who need it. I think the difficulty is if we choose to use that for these one-off payments, what it does is it magnifies unfairnesses in the system. But also it kind of drives a bit of a coach and horses through, universal credit is designed to have the taper, so you're always better off. Doing this then undoes that careful design, but that's purely because of the one-off payment, not because we're using social security. The only other group to add to what colleagues have said that we've heard people are concerned about missing out are people with no recourse to public funds or people waiting to move on to UC because of immigration status.
Yeah. If we can turn now to low-income households who are not eligible for the cost of living payment, and thinking specifically of people who are struggling with in-work poverty, starting with yourself, Ms. Bernard, have you seen more households coming forward not eligible for the cost of living payment, struggling more than those who've received them?
So I would say probably not, because if you're not eligible for the cost of living payments, it's because generally your income is high enough you don't qualify for universal credit. So I think we do know that people who are on universal credit are much more likely to be going without essentials than people who aren't. But I think you're right that there is that group of people who are a very small amount above the threshold or have fluctuating incomes. So we do see a lot of people coming to food banks in insecure work. That seems to be a big issue, and I think you're right. These kinds of one-off payments are going to be very inconsistent in whether those people happen to qualify at any one time.
Okay. Does anybody in the panel want to add anything to that already?
I'd just add really endorse on the points that it makes the last pound of universal credit way too important for people, and lots of people rightly won't have applied for those. I would just add that I really do buy the points that people just outside the system have struggled a great deal. One of the things that we've argued for to sit in concert with the social security system is to have an energy social tariff to reflect the fact that this crisis is not just about incomes, it's about people's situations, it's about how hard their homes are to heat, and you need a system for making sure those people, whether they're inside universal credit or not, receive the support they need.
Just to add to Morgan's point on the impact that people's situation has, we've definitely found that the need is most acute amongst people with a learning disability on benefits and in receipt of cost of living payments. But we have seen families who aren't in receipt of significant state welfare support, but who have been particularly affected by high energy bills. They may have a child who has a medical condition that requires significantly increased energy. We've heard of some households who are having energy bills of up to £1,000 higher than the average. So they're experiencing real hardship. And part of that is because there's a chasm between the underlying household incomes of households with a disability and those without. The Resolution Foundation put the figure at 44% if disability social security is not included, which I think just exposes the fact that disabled people are hugely vulnerable to the rises in cost of essentials, regardless of if they're in receipt of high levels of benefit support or not.
Okay, and Stephen, I've just got one final question.
Very briefly, if you would.
It's just in relation to I've seen a constituency case from Lanarkshire where somebody had a joint claim with a then partner for universal credit. A couple split up and that person was not eligible for the cost of living payment. Do you have recommendations as to how we might be able to ensure that those who miss out on payments can be supported in future?
I think the main thing is don't rely on one-off payments in a moment of time. If we were putting the money into making the underlying rate of benefits adequate, then I think the system could deal with that. If we're using one-off payments, you will always get these circumstances of when it will be unfair.
Thank you, Sir Stephen.
Thank you very much. Senator Thwaite.
Which are better, the cost of living payments or an increment to regular monthly benefits, bearing in mind that the increment during the pandemic was only paid to universal credit? And there is undoubtedly a number of people who believe that, the one-off costs, large one-off costs, are better addressed by the cost of living payments.
I would echo what Helen has just said, and I think the evidence is pretty clear that from a policy design it's better to have increments to universal credit than a system of one-off payments. That does have certain drawbacks. So, as you mentioned, there were ongoing problems with the legacy system in trying to extend the £20 uplift to that system. So it may be the case that while we maintain the legacy system, you need a parallel system of one-off payments for them while having an uplift for everybody else. They would make the entire process a lot smoother for the people who are coming to us, and as Helen says, it would remove a great degree of arbitrariness in who receives the payment. There are other things that would need thinking through, like interaction with the benefits cap and interaction with two-child limit, depending on how you applied the increase in the base rate, but I think clearly superior to one-off payments.
I think the only other thing I would add to that is I think we need to think about stability of income as well as amount of income. When people are getting by on very low levels of income, they are doing a lot of financial juggling. They're generally trying to pay off debts. They're trying to work out which bill to get into arrears with at which time. They are doing incredibly tight budgeting, and having fluctuating payments makes that far harder. And when you add into that most of these people who are in work, many people are already having to deal with earnings which are not steady. I think we would want the social security system to help people stabilise their finances, not create an even more unstable situation for people. It makes it very hard to plan and to budget effectively.
Thank you very much. Steve McCabe.
Thank you. I want to ask a couple of quick questions about the £150 disability cost of living payment. So I think I want to ask Maddie. You said in an earlier answer there that you didn't think everyone who was eligible had actually received the payment. Are you able to put a figure on that? Do you have a notion of the numbers or the percentage who missed out?
No, we're not. And like I said, you know, we're confident that the vast numbers of people have received the payment. So eligibility has not been our primary concern. It has been really about the payment amount itself and the extent to which it has essentially been inadequate and hasn't.
I just wondered when you mentioned that if it was a significant figure. The other point is you say, NCAP say that the £150 is inadequate. What would you do instead?
Well, I think there's 2 points really. I think if government were intending on making additional one-off payments, they would need to be at a much higher rate and would actually need to be commensurate with the need for people with a learning disability. £150 has been inadequate. It has effectively just replaced the warm home discount payment that many disabled people received and are now ineligible for, since 290,000 people were removed from that scheme who normally receive it. But I think a more sustainable long-term solution is obviously those benefit uprates that colleagues have discussed before. Those regular increases in income would just have a profound effect on people with a learning.
I just want to push you on this. What is a much higher rate?
Well, I think it's difficult to put a figure on it because it depends on people's needs, their disabilities, the nature of the suite of government support that's in place. You know, if improvements are made to local support, then that would obviously have an effect on the rate that, you know, a suitable rate that we could suggest. So I think before I say the number, I think it would what I would advocate for is an independent review of it, so that there's a clear rationale that meets the need of people.
I just wonder if you had a figure in mind. I better leave it there.
Thank you. Debbie Abrahams.
I don't know if Helen wants to carry on from that, because I know Trussell Trust and JRF have been doing a lot around that. It doesn't specifically relate to disabled people, but do you want to mention?
Yes, thank you. So we've done research with Joseph Rowntree Foundation and found that if you're a single person, to cover your basic costs, your essentials, so food, basic household goods, bills, you need £120 a week. That's without the additional costs that disabled people face. So I would say that is the absolute minimum that we would want to see everyone getting, so that people aren't left, you know, hungry, cold, in the dark, which is what we're seeing at the moment.
Just to add on that, I think one thing it would be useful to understand from the government is what kind of process they went through to come up with the estimate of £150 for disabled people. I think it's relatively well understood what the additional costs are for disabled people along a variety of different impairments, and certainly we have seen that the cost of living crisis for Citizens Advice clients has been overwhelmingly driven by disability. So if you come to Citizens Advice and you're disabled, you are more likely to come to us about a cost of living issue than you are any other problem.
Thank you. Maddie, can I just pick up and get you mentioned before in terms of the scope, extra cost report and so on, and it has gone up dramatically, hasn't it? £1,122 a month extra cost if you consider inflation as well. We know that 1 in 3 disabled people will be living in poverty, double that of non-disabled people. Does the £150 extra, I mean, we welcome it, but the £150 extra cost for, in terms of disability, cost of living payment, doesn't really touch the sides, does it?
No, not at all. It's equivalent to £2.88 per week, which just isn't clearly not commensurate with the need, particularly when we're, if you're mindful of the extra costs that people with a learning disability have, and how they've been disproportionately impacted by the cost of living crisis, particularly on 2 measures of household income. One, food. We know that people with a learning disability tend to have, certain foods they need to have because of medical or sensory needs, and a lot of those costs are fixed, so household expenditure can't be changed around that. So that's been really impactful. And then again, yes, secondly, on energy, we know that many disabled people have significantly increased energy needs and can't cut down on those because they might be using energy for mobility and hygiene needs, running electric wheelchairs, hoists, more frequent use of washing machines, running vital medical equipment, oxygen concentrators, ventilators, feeding tubes, which are just vital and can't be switched off. And then other needs that pertain to health conditions. People's homes might need to be heated to a certain temperature, or people might be experiencing the increased energy costs of overnight or 24-hour carers. So all of that has kind of created this perfect storm where people with a learning disability are disproportionately impacted by the cost of living crisis, but also starting this whole crisis from a place of real economic inequality, like you said, more likely to experience poverty, having to contend with those significant extra costs in the disability price tag. But again, with the group that we support, people with a learning disability have fewer opportunities, paid work, so they can increase their household income. So, they're just far less able to.
Thanks, Maddie. That's really briefly, Sir Stephen. Child poverty statistics came out this week. We've seen a massive increase in many areas. It's not uniform across the UK. In my own constituency, it's nearly 1 in 2 children will be living in poverty. The big increase, Stephen, as you all know, is the increase in children living in poverty in working families, up to more than 7 in 10. 7 in 10. And destitution level poverty. So what difference has the cost of living payment made to child poverty? Who wants to tackle that one very quickly, because I don't want to try the patience of the chair.
So I would say it has certainly helped those families that have got it, but of course it's a flat payment. It's not calibrated for the number of people you're trying to feed, so it has clearly gone less far if you're a family with children than if you're a single person or a couple. And I think it's worth saying, so with the food bank statistics, we have seen a faster rise in need among families with children than we have among families without children. So I think, that's obviously another argument to use the system as it's designed, because it has built-in calibration to family size and so on.
The only thing to add is single parents is the thing that jumps out in our data more than anything else. We see a vastly disproportionate number of people who are single parent families coming to us for crisis support, or coming to us because they can't make their budget add up.
Yeah, it'd be useful, and don't please answer this, but to get some figures in terms of how the Essentials Guarantee may impact on reducing that child poverty level. Thank you, Sir Stephen.
Thank you very much. Celine Saxby.
Thank you and good morning. My question specifically to you, Sally, is about following on from the written evidence that we received. It said that many of those eligible for pension credit don't receive it and as a result miss out on cost of living payments on top. From your experience, do you have any indication of how many people that is, or the proportion of pensions it's impacting, please?
Well, the latest DWP figures are now a couple of years out of date, they're 2019 to 2020, and that was about a third of pensioners who should be getting pension credit missing out. That's nearly 800 pensioner families. Since then, they probably take-up has increased a bit, but we don't think there's been huge inroads into that. It would be good to have some more up-to-date figures. But yes, I think we can say that it continues to be a big problem, people not claiming pension credit and indeed other benefits that they're entitled to.
And the government's obviously runs a significant schemes, and I represent North Devon, so I have a lot of pensioners in my own patch, and I have done numerous photo shoots with the pension minister to try and actually put this out, just to try and encourage those people that haven't come forward. And we've obviously had evidence here before, but do you have any other thoughts? Is that helping, or is there another way that we could reach these people to persuade them to apply for what they're entitled to?
Yeah. I think it's really positive that last sort of year or so the government has been going out proactively with messages about encouraging people to claim. And, a lot of the messages that we put out are kind of similar. We kind of work together. Using the sort of deadline for pension credit in order to get the cost of living payment has been a really useful hook. That's really important for awareness raising, which we need to continue doing. I don't think awareness raising on itself is going to reach everybody, because it's not just about knowing that a benefit like pension credit exists. You've got to know that it applies to you in your own particular circumstances. You've got to know where you can get help if you need it, and there are other barriers around people not wanting to ask for help, or older people say, oh, there's people worse off than me, I'll just turn the heating down. So what we think that the government could do is, first of all, well, use data matching more to identify people who are missing out, and also making the systems more joined up. So in terms of data matching, ideally people would receive pension credit automatically, but we know that government doesn't have all the information. There isn't all the information, wouldn't be able to tell you exactly who could get pension credit and how much they could get. But if you think of the data that HMRC have, that DWP have, that local authorities have, if all that could be sort of used to try to pinpoint those who are most likely to be entitled, and then you could target them with very clear information saying, we know that you've got this kind of pension, you know that we get this, we think it's very likely that you'll get X amount of pension credit, this is where you can get help and support to claim. So we think it'd be really useful to have a project that look at, to the extent that government can use existing data to identify and then really target information and support to people. I think the second thing is looking how systems work, and in particular I'm thinking of the three main means-tested benefits for pensioners, which are pension credit, housing benefit and council tax reduction. So they're the three benefits that people may be able to get in order to help with their sort of daily living and their housing costs. But they're not fully joined up, even though the rules, they're based on similar rules. Council tax rebate, councils can set their own rules, but not for pensioners. It's a standard rule for pensioners. Housing benefit is national rules. If you apply for pension credit, the information can be passed to the local authority. You've still got to make a claim within a certain time, and then that information is there, but you've still got to go through another step. If you apply for council tax rebate or housing benefit, that information isn't then passed to pension credit, even if it's all the information that Pension Service needs to work out your claim. So some local authorities will be doing exercises to look at their data and identify people who are maybe entitled. And again, they would have to go and say, make a claim for Pension Service. But it just feels like, those three benefits should be a lot more joined up, so that, if you approach either the local authority or the Pension Service and you provide all the data needed to make the claim, your entitlement for all the three benefits should be worked out.
Thank you for that. And do you have any thoughts on what would be the best way for the government to support those pensioners who just miss out on those cost of living payments?
Yeah, this is such a big issue. As I mentioned earlier, people who've perhaps got a small amount of savings brings them just over the pension credit rate. This includes quite a lot of people who are getting housing benefit or council tax rebate, as I mentioned. And we feel the best way is to extend payments to people getting all of those means-tested benefits. We have had people coming to us to say, well, I've heard the government saying there are these extra payments for people getting means-tested benefits. It says on the government website, housing benefit is means-tested, but I'm told I can't receive anything. So I think because these are means-tested benefits, that would help take that extra support a bit, sort of slightly bigger group.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Sally, can I just add, do you think a significant number of pensioners have applied for pension credit in order to qualify for the cost of living payment?
I think it's certainly been a good hook and a good sort of trigger to encourage people to claim. We have had, certainly at HUK, we've had more people coming for help. Some of them will undoubtedly go on to make a claim for pension credit. Increasingly, our local advisors are saying people are coming to us for help. We'd normally do a benefit check, but this time we can't offer anything extra. So it's difficult to know. And of course, the government information, they can tell you how many additional or how many claims were made in a month. They can't tell you which ones were successful for pension credit. It would be very good to be able to judge how successful take-up campaigns and different initiatives are, but the systems don't seem to allow that.
Okay, thank you. Siobhan Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry about my voice. It's on the way out. So we've kind of touched on the fact the government tried to get money out quickly, and in doing so, they created a basically simple payment system, and using a mechanism that's already there, which is the benefit system, which is imperfect, but it was for speed. So I'm kind of interested to know from all of you whether you would sacrifice speed of payments for an attempt to be more bespoke and bring in sort of a targeted for size of household, for example, and whether you think that's important. and whether that you think that could be accurately done at scale. So just to go to Morgan first.
Yeah, sure. So I think it could be accurately done at scale, and the reason is if you take universal credit by itself, there may be more complexities for the legacy system. But take universal credit by itself, there are basically two ways that you could increase universal credits to achieve the same effect as a cost of living payments. You could just increase the standard allowance by an equivalent amount, or you could, if you were more concerned about scaling payments with household size and other characteristics, you could grow each of the elements of universal credit proportionately, so that you are giving additional support in the way that is
wouldn't be on a one-off. This is on a more frequent basis. But on a one-off basis, do you think there is a mechanism?
I think you could do this on a one-off. Obviously, I think everybody here would also be of the view that a permanent increase is required because benefit rates are too low, but you could do this on a temporary basis, as we did with the £20 uplift.
Maddie?
Yeah, I would echo everything that Morgan said. I think it would just be really key to contend with those complexities that individuals who receive legacy payments experience. And I think it would just really depend on how it was operationalised. But we would be really keen to see that permanent increase in the benefit rate, just because it's so inadequate at the moment for people with a learning disability.
I'd echo that. I think one of the benefits of universal credit is it is very flexible. So you can choose to do an uplift very quickly, which, as we saw during the pandemic, it's only the legacy benefits where you have to do something more clunky and it takes longer. But I mean, happily, I don't think that's now a choice the government has to make for most people. They don't have to choose between speed and accuracy because the system will let you do both.
Your view is that the payments should be adjusted for household and youth. Is that what you were saying about families and people presenting to the food banks at the moment?
Yeah, so if you run it through universal credit, you can just use the existing system. So you can increase the standard allowance and the child element, for instance, and that would enable you to direct those payments. I mean, one thing that was very welcome was the government did ensure that they lifted the benefit cap so that people didn't miss out on extra help because they had hit that arbitrary limit. So you would need to do that as well. But I think the system is, in general, well designed to do what we need it to.
Perhaps not necessarily something for your clientele.
Most older people live in single person or couple households, so I'll leave that one.
Of your view of policy, do you think that if we made the adjustment for households, do you think that it would then have an impact on single age working households, single person working households? Do you think there will need to be a trade-off because the payments couldn't continue across?
Well, I suppose an adjustment made reduced the amount for sort of people on their own. We wouldn't support that because often your costs are higher, but I think you're probably looking at giving extra support to larger households, so that would kind of be a different issue.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Neil Coyle.
Thanks, Chair. Morgan, you painted the most stark picture of the situation facing people across the country. I think you said it was the bleakest in citizen advice history, including during the Second World War. How do you square that with closing the Citizen Advice Bureau at the Blue in Bermondsey, in my constituency, which serves quite a disadvantaged community?
I would have to look at the specifics of that situation, but the challenges that we face as a service are extraordinary. We have vastly more demand than we are able to offer. Advice and funding has been under continuous pressure, so we're always looking for opportunities to make sure that we can reduce costs where possible while maintaining the overall level of provision for our services.
I think the citizen advice turnover was £153, £154 million last year. And the mission statement is you won't struggle to get help from us. So I just wonder if you could share, perhaps, Chair, I appreciate it's not perhaps relevant to the whole committee, you could share some information about what other options were considered locally. If the rent was the primary issue for the move, then I wonder if there were other means of keeping a local facility that I'd be very happy to support if I can. I think it's an excellent service, and I'm very concerned about the loss to my community. But I wanted to ask about the number of organisations, including Child Poverty Action Group and Entitled To, have expressed concern about the cliff-edge nature of the eligibility criteria for cost of living payments. This has been touched on already, but I wonder, do any of your organisations have data on the number of people you're seeing affected by that specific issue?
So not specific data, but it's certainly a huge problem. We're seeing lots of people for whom they are just outside the threshold for receiving universal credit and therefore being ineligible for cost of living payments. I think it's probably the central issue that we see.
It's been touched on that people come into food banks, and you're saying there's a huge number, but how do you know? How is it logged in your systems that these are people who should qualify for support, aren't quite getting it? And then how are you turning that into recommendations for how to improve the system? Who else is it that would warrant better support? I think Morgan, you touched on energy, and someone else touched on single parents. But what is the database for the recommendation, and what is the recommendation, please?
So I can touch on our data, but others will have comments as well. The driving factor in our data that informs how we think about this is people who are in what we call negative budgets. So people who come to us, they go through the full debt advice process, we go through their income and expenditure with a fine-tooth comb and still can't make their budgets add up. For lots of those people, they are on a low income but not receiving a cost of living payment, and it seems very, when you look at their situation, it looks very reasonable that because of their high heating costs, because of how this crisis has been driven by the energy crisis, there needs to be some solution that captures those group of people.
So I say from our experience, so the vast majority of people who are forced to turn to food banks are on a means-tested benefit, but it is not enough for them to afford essentials. That's why they're there. But it's also noticeable that an enormous proportion are not receiving all of what you would expect because they are affected by debt deductions at source, by the cap, by the two-child limit, or by sanctions. So I think there is that problem that even if you're on the benefit, you may not actually be getting everything that the system has assessed you as needing. What I would say, though, is what we do see is the majority of people coming to food banks are disabled, and most of those who aren't are living with someone who is. It's an enormous driver. But many of those people are not getting any disability-related benefits. Now, we obviously don't know for sure how many should be, but it is particularly problems getting PIP. So a lot of the financial inclusion advice that we're giving through food banks is trying to help people get PIP. And I know for the work we do with Citizens Advice with the helpline that we run jointly, that is, I think, the top benefit issue. So I think getting access to disability benefits is one of the biggest drivers of people ending up in this situation.
And I would add to that we also find a lot of older people are missing out on attendance allowance. So we've talked about pension credit take-up, which is getting more attention, but the other benefits like attendance allowance and like PIP are also, we don't have figures for them, but we know just from our day-to-day advice services that people are missing out on that. Just in terms of, so I was going to say in terms of the numbers just above pension credit for perspective of older people. I was saying earlier that we'd like to see cost of living payments extended to people who are getting housing benefit and council tax reduction. Looking at the figures, it looks like that might be around 400,000 pensioners who are getting a means-tested benefit but not pension credit or pensioner households. But I can send you some information about those figures. But
That would be really helpful. And do any of your organisations support the Child Poverty Action Group's suggestion that those who applied for but got nil awards in universal credit get help as well? Is this something that there is a consensus on in the sector?
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
that looks positive. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask, particularly Morgan, and have a question I put to Sally. Have you seen people applying for benefit in order to get the cost of living payment? I mean, has this been helpful for benefit take-up, this size?
So if I look at our data before the cost of living crisis, we were helping around 10,000 people a month with a general benefits entitlement advice section. That's gone up to around 20,000 a month, so it has been a really big increase. Partly that's driven just by general cost of living concerns and people wanting to make sure that they are claiming benefits that they otherwise wouldn't. Anecdotally, our advisors say a big driver has been putting them in a position to claim cost of living payments.
Right.
So we haven't seen particularly it driving take-up, but one thing to mention is the DWP doesn't publicise which day, what is the qualifying day. And if the government was going to go down this route again, one thing they could do would actually be to publicise what is the qualifying day, because that could then be used as a call to action by people across the sector to say we've got to get you on this by this day. And that might be a more purposeful way to try and do that. I mean, we know, about £19 billion of benefits go unclaimed each year. It's about £7.5 billion for universal credit. So there are a lot of people missing out on all the support in addition to these extra payments.
the advantage with pension credit is that because you can get 3 months backdated payment, we have been able to say make a claim by a certain date, which indeed the DWP has done as well. So I said earlier, it's a very good hook to get publicity around benefits going unclaimed.
Morgan, in the citizens' advice case, are people coming to you because of the cost of living payment, because it's in their mind that there could be a way of them getting that, or is it once they've come in, the advisors say actually you could qualify?
As you'd expect, it's a bit of a mix. So we see both kinds of cases.
Okay, some people at least are aware that this is an opportunity. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Nigel Mills.
And we've talked over the years about the danger of cliff edges, and I mean, have those dangers come to pass? Have we seen people trying to avoid taking extra hours to make sure they don't max out their UC that month and miss out on 300 odd quid tax free? I mean, have we seen strange behaviours creeping into the system that we probably didn't really want to see?
So if people were fully informed and following these things in as much detail as the rest of us, it would be the rational thing to do, particularly to Helen's point, but they don't advertise the take-up date, would be to suppress your income in the period where you know that a cost of living payment eligibility criteria is likely to fall. That'd be the sensible thing to do given the scale of the money involved, and so you would expect it to have a potential chilling effect and run contrary to the very good intentions of universal credit in making sure that you are never worse off for earning an additional £1. Now, in practice, people probably aren't, on average, following with a degree of detail that those of us around this room would. But some people will be, and it's a very bad property of a policy system to encourage that kind of behaviour from people.
And I would only add that most of the people we're talking about are in a fairly dire situation, and if every week you are struggling to put food on the table and keep the lights on and seeing your bills and debt mounting up, I would be very surprised if there are people who could be earning more who decide not to that week or that couple of weeks. I think people don't have the level of financial buffer that would lead you to make those kinds of decisions.
Yeah. So the government response to this crisis was I remember these things now. We had the funny council tax in reverse thing, which worked quite well if you're on direct debit, was a bit fiddlier if you weren't. We then had the money back from your energy bill company spread over 6 months. We then had the cost of living payments, and we then had the capping of your energy bill directly by your supplier. If we're going to have another, heaven forbid, another crisis like this, I mean, which of those do you think actually was the right way to go about helping people? I mean, is it a combination of capping the bill and then support for those who can't afford the difference, or did you prefer one of the other options that was there?
If we could not do the council tax rebates again, that would be much appreciated. I think at the time we called it strange, complicated and untargeted, and I think it was probably a policy instrument that we should put to bed. On the other options, look, I think what we've ended up doing has been more expensive than it needed to be, because we have instantiated a energy price guarantee for everyone and then supplemented it with cost of living payments for those on lowest incomes, and we've done it in quite a, I would say, unstrategic way. It's been going from crisis to crisis rather than addressing the underlying cause. I think if we were to face this situation again, and I certainly wouldn't bet against us needing a third round of cost of living support, it would be much better to put in place a proper energy social tariff, which is reflective of the energy costs that people have based on their household characteristics and property condition, and that can reach out into further up into the middle of the income distribution, because when energy bills go up as dramatically as they do, the demand for support won't just be needed by the poorest in society, it'll be needed much higher up as well.
Yes, I mean, we certainly support the idea of a social tariff. I guess you do need a combination of measures. So the social tariff is about reducing costs for those with the hardest to heat houses and the lowest incomes, and then you need to look at sort of decent incomes. Although I think, you know, it's not ideal to be giving one-off lump sums, and we've talked quite a bit about you know, the need for regular income. They have been important for people, and they have got some money out to a lot of people quite quickly. So ideally you wouldn't need further rounds of one-off sums, but they do serve a purpose, and maybe they will be needed.
And I would say we should try and learn from our experience. We've tried quite a lot of different things in the last few years, and rather than repeat any of them, so, you know, council tax thing was obviously a disaster, and we should just all collectively forget about it. I think we've also learned that something that's fully universal just meant lots and lots of people got the money who genuinely didn't need it. We've learned that one-off payments help for a very short time, but don't actually help people get stable and be able to afford things. I think what we learned from the £20 uplift during the pandemic was we've had really good analysis of that, and that made such a big difference to poverty, to hardship, to debt, to all sorts of things. The only downside was it was again a flat rate. But I think what we've learned from all of these things is that we should use the tools that are designed for the job, which is the benefit system, and we should run whatever money we've got through that. And then something like a social tariff can take care of those people in the middle that we shouldn't be funneling lots of money to be honest, because most of the time they don't need it. But where there are kind of pockets of people who do, you can pick it up through that.
I would echo Helen's point, but I think it's key as well to draw out the fact that in these additional measures that we're discussing, like the social tariff, we need to think about those design elements that contend with the needs of people with a learning disability. So, for example, it needs to be automated, it needs to be easy for people to access, because we've seen the problems that have come to pass when government support, for example, the energy bill support schemes, there's been significant accessibility barriers for people with a learning disability, which has meant that they've been disadvantaged and haven't received the amount of support that they maybe should have.
I'm sort of intrigued that, quite rightly, we don't like the idea of asking councils to deal with this, even though they should know people in their area, and they should be kind of like relatively benevolent organisations being public sector, but we think asking energy companies to work out which households to target based on the quality of their housing, how many people in there, what sort of income they have, is a realistic thing you could roll out quickly. It kind of feels really quite hard.
Yeah, it's definitely not a realistic thing to roll out quickly. The data on property characteristics is collected already by the Valuation Office Agency under what was formerly BEIS. Not sure where it sits now. So all of that data exists and is already used in matching for the warm home discounts. There are additional complexities, mostly in reaching beyond universal credit, because that would require integration with HMRC data potentially. But the principle of being able to target based on how hard a home is to heat is fairly well established. On the council tax reduction part, I think that the key difficulty was in both in how payments were processed if you earn in direct debits payments, as you mentioned, also the imperfect grading of different homes, leading to lots of people being left out. I think there is a place for local welfare assistance through continuation and boosting of household support fund for people in crisis situations, but that should principally be for people in crisis rather than what we've seen, which is grants to help people with their ordinary living costs.
I just ask as a final thing, one of our favourite topics we come back to. I mean, this was an inflation crisis, and benefits generally go up by inflation. I mean, have we just exposed the fact that putting up benefits in April via the inflation number in September is actually not a particularly useful way of trying to keep something that's meant to provide a standard of living to keep up with the standard of living that you want, if you're always quite so far behind and quite so unresponsive to it?
Yeah, I mean, it is, I think for a lot of periods of history it's been fine because inflation just hasn't changed that much. But you're right, this has exposed the fact that in an unusual period you can get these effects. I mean, I think there is the government does have the ability to choose to put it up by more than the previous September's inflation. It's entirely in their gift to say we will actually put it up by the current inflation, for instance. And the way that UC works, there's no technical reason you couldn't do that. So I think in a sense it's a kind of political choice how you want to kind of spread that spending.
Yeah, I think if you look at the historical data, September doesn't have any kind of special magic properties as a month to look at inflation. In fact, I think it was mostly chosen because historically under the legacy system, it genuinely was more difficult. We've got a good system now, so let's use that flexibility to increase benefits in a way that isn't just tied to the idea of look at a single month's inflation, but actually involves a degree of judgment about what does the inflation landscape look like? Are we expecting bills to continue going up for a longer period? Well, then let's make sure that we're over-aiming on increasing benefits.
Yes, I mean, I think having that 6 months lag, as I said, is particularly unfortunate at the time when bills have soared so much. And sometimes it works in people's favours, to be honest. Inflation can fall, but I mean, it's been really serious this year. And it feels like 6 months ought to at least be reduced a bit, even if you kept the same kind of system. DWP may tell you that's not possible, but it just feels like they ought to be able to get that gap shorter.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That concludes the questions we wanted to put to you. Thank you all very much indeed for joining, for the very helpful information you've given.
Thank you.
Thank you. If you'd like to step down the table then. And for joining us. I think you've all heard the earlier session as well, so that's a useful background for the discussion we're going to have. Can I ask each of you, as I did the first panel, to very briefly tell us who you are, starting with Maxwell Marlowe.
Hi, I'm Maxwell Marlowe. I'm Director of Research at the Adam Smith Institute.
Thank you. Fran Bennett.
I'm Fran Bennett, Associate Fellow at the Department of Social Policy and Intervention, University of Oxford.
Thank you. And Richard Hunt.
I'm Richard Hunt and I'm Head of Catering Hospitality and Country Parks for Leicestershire County Council.
You've come a long way today, so we're grateful to you. We're grateful to all of you. Can I put the first question to you and ask each of you to say what you make of the way the cost of living support payments were targeted? Do you think it was effective, the targeting? Do you think it could have been done better? Maxwell Marlowe.
Well, yes. The belief of the Institute, essentially, these were quite effective payments. They were put out in a timely and high take-up manner, essentially, given the fact that there wasn't, how do I say this? There wasn't specific targeting, and you obviously had to be in the system in the first place. I think it was quite well targeted at areas that needed it the most. And from what we kind of saw over the period of the cost of living crisis is essentially that where the money went, it did fill some of the gaps that were left. Reading some of the evidence that's been submitted to the committee beforehand, we were particularly happy about the fact it was kind of a lump sum payment that was given out. It was quite good for individual households to essentially look at their bills, look at what their plans were, and better allocate the money to where it should go. That was very encouraging, and we were quite happy to see that.
Thank you. Fran Bennett.
Thank you. I mean, I think we want to try and not repeat what's been said in several sessions already about the impact of these payments. So just to summarise, I think cash first is the best approach for a start. And obviously, as Child Poverty Action Group said, at speed and at scale was possible with the ad hoc payment system that the government's got. But that's also got limitations, particularly in terms of the qualifying period and also in terms of, as has been said this morning, the one payment per benefit unit, which I think is a real issue. Also, it's got problems because of the algorithm for the universal credit calculation, which in itself needs to be looked at, and the cuts in the benefit system already. So benefit cap, 2-child limit, local housing allowance under 25s, which are therefore implicit in using the current benefit system to help with cost of living. The inadequate amount already, which people have said, the take-up problem. The government is no longer publishing figures on any working age take-up of benefits. And of course, we've got the Household Support Fund as well, and I'll leave Richard to talk about that. The government has said it will evaluate the cost of living payments, so I think a useful recommendation by the committee would be that it should publish that evaluation. So I think that would be very helpful. And I mean, it's just worth saying that universal payments actually target all those in need better than any means-tested payments happen to do.
Thank you. And Richard Hunt.
And I think I can only echo what others have said, that sort of our feeling has been that it's been something of a blunt instrument perhaps, and that there's methods that offer more nuance around how support can be offered, and that the Household Support Fund has been a good example of that.
Just tell us a little bit more about the Household Support Fund. How effective has that been in Leicestershire in reaching people?
Yeah, so in Leicestershire, I mean, every Household Support Fund is different. It's money given by the Department for Work and Pensions to top-tier local authorities. And Leicestershire's approach, it's had 6 elements to it, which have ranged from support for children on free school meals in the holidays, through to allow support for food banks to purchase food for distribution, also allowing charities to purchase energy efficient white goods to give to people in need to again lower their energy costs. But then one of the biggest bits we do is a referral scheme for support with food and fuel vouchers. And so under the current iteration of the Household Support Fund that started in April and runs for the next 12 months, we've allocated £3 million to that. And the way our schemes worked in Leicestershire is that rather than individuals or households applying to us for support through that scheme, instead they work with agencies they're already working with, and those agencies are a referring body into the scheme in Leicestershire. So we feel that we've got this group of well over 175 referring bodies now in the county who are already working with clients, already working with households who are in need of support, and referring them through to us for support with the household support scheme. We know this way we're picking up people who fall through some of the cracks, some of the people who may be subject to some of the cliff edges that were talked about in the earlier session and things like that. So again, there's that kind of nuance applied there. We sort of set out the broad eligibility criteria within our policies, but our household support fund's been very much set up around trusting professionals to make the decision over whether someone requires referral and requires support. So again, we kind of think it's accommodating a breadth of need that perhaps isn't offered otherwise. And for us, one of the things we're really proud of is that we know that everyone engaging with that system, because they're engaging with a referring body, is getting that ongoing support as well. So this isn't simply money that's given to a household and that's that. Because they have to have that form of referral, it means that there's a longevity to it. And certainly even when they're referred through and receive the money from us within the local authority, that's processed by a part of our public health department, who will ensure that people being referred to us get a telephone call and a chance to discuss with them whether they are taking up the correct amount of benefits to which they're entitled. Also maybe a referral through to the Warm Homes scheme within the local authority, or any other support that can be offered. And that's something I think a lot of local authorities are very concerned about, is that the cost of living payments are all time limited, and we're all very concerned about what happens at the end of all of those. So we've been working really hard to build that sustainability in, so that when, if and when these payments come to an end, people aren't just left.
Thank you very much. David Linden.
Thank you very much, Sir Stephen. I think we're all quite well versed now on the kind of cliff edge nature of these payments. Indeed, Ms Bennett, I think you took part in a joint committee session between ourselves and Treasury on cliff edges. I mean, given the kind of cliff edge nature of the eligibility criteria, does this mean that the blunt cut-off generally works given the number of payments issued? And we'll start with Maxwell and work with them.
Could you just repeat that last point, please?
So, given the kind of eligibility criteria and the fact that there's a cliff edge built into it, does that blunt cut-off generally work given the number of payments that are issued?
Yeah, absolutely. We have done quite a bit of research on the nature of cliff edges within the fiscal system. A lot of it to do with the Chancellor's recent childcare reforms, and seeing that essentially people receiving the benefits and these payments are, they're smart people, and they, have the data in front of them, essentially looking at the bills coming out. And as was echoed on the last panel, that last pound really is very, very important. And as I think we may come on to later, having a little bit more of a smart system with a better taper rate, a little better adjusted, more accurate, would definitely help make the system a bit more dynamic, because although the department hasn't released all the data yet, and it's definitely a recommendation that they're much more transparent on what the data coming out of this will be and released in a much shorter time period, it's certainly the case that I think when we look back on this as lessons learned, there will be a significant deficit essentially between people who would have been eligible but have essentially, in circumstances not owing to, they're trying very hard to, put food on the table, etc., we essentially will see a large drop-off in the kind of take-up rate of that. And it's made people worse off, unfortunately, and I think it's quite bad for the economy overall and for communities around the country.
Ms Bennett?
I think there was quite a lot said both in the Treasury Select Committee, at which some of you were present, and also just now in terms of the previous session about cliff edges, so I won't go on about that. I mean, one of them that wasn't mentioned was It may depend on the accident of timing in terms of how likely you are to get payments, of course. But I think as I say, I think that the nature of cliff edges has been adequately covered by other people. I mean, obviously the one-off payments were able to be quick, accurate, straightforward, but it also is worth saying, I think, that both with the Household Support Fund, if Richard doesn't mind me saying so, and with the completely separate ad hoc payment system that the DWP has actually developed, this is complexifying the benefit system further when, of course, universal credit was meant to be simplifying it, and universal payments are simple, like child benefit, for example, used to be. So I think we're actually developing parallel systems of giving people awards, which we might well look at in future and say we should take them back down again to a few simpler systems rather than the accretions that have been happening over the last few months. I mean, understandably so. The other thing I just wanted to say was, I mean, the government was doing the one-off payments partly because of timing. It was quicker to use the ad hoc payment system that they've developed than it was to do other things. But they did cost of living payments in 2022, and they could have, as Child Poverty Action Group has said, could have rethought them for 2023-24 and didn't really. They went on with the same system. So I think that's worth querying a bit.
You're going to disagree with Ms Bennett and say that actually no, the system is much simpler now and easier from the County Council's point of view?
I'm not sure the County Council would have an opinion over whether it adds complexity. I suppose what local authorities would argue is that because we know our local communities very well, what schemes like household support funds allowed us to do is to be very targeted in our approach. And I think that's something that a lot of people have echoed today, is that these schemes lack that targeting, and local government's quite well placed to offer some of that.
Could I just clarify what I said there? For I'm certainly not arguing against the need for one-off lump sum emergency payments in crisis. We had the local welfare assistance scheme. We still have the local welfare assistance scheme. Money could have been put into that to expand it. And we need long-term sustainable funding for one-off emergency payments for people as well. I certainly wouldn't argue against that. Whether it's done at local or national level is a different issue. But since we've got the local welfare assistance scheme, we ought to be looking at the fact that the funding is no longer ring-fenced for that, and 35, I think, councils have actually stopped doing a local welfare assistance scheme completely, including my own county council of Oxfordshire, although the new regime is probably going to reintroduce it. But that might have been used and should certainly be sustainably built up in future.
Very helpful, thank you. So, Steve.
Just picking up that point, Fran, I mean, the Household Support Fund, in effect, provided additional resources for local welfare assistance? Or?
Well, that's kind of what I mean, although I think probably Household Support Fund was also given out by the county councils or the other district council levels that didn't have a local welfare assistance scheme anymore.
Okay. Celine Saxby.
Thank you and good morning. How else do you think the government could better support those households in need of financial aid for essentials during this cost of living crisis? Who'd like to go first?
I'm happy to go first on this. It may fall outside of the remit of the committee, but there's quite a lot of general tax reform that could take place. If you'll, humour me for a bit. Stuff like fuel duty is very high, and unfortunately the government's public transport provision isn't that good outside of metropolitan areas, so a lot of households need to drive some way to get to work, get to school, medical appointments, to facilitate care. And the OBR puts fuel duty at a cost of £867 per household. And that's quite a lot of money if you're already incredibly tight on your budget, and the UK already has some of the highest fuel duty rates in Europe, if not the world. So we definitely encourage government, to have another look at that, especially given people in metropolitan areas can walk or bike or take the tube to work, and it's just not the same outside in the regions. Other things such as kind of food and drink taxes, the more targeted stuff. When you take a kind of decile look at the people in the economy, you see essentially people from the 10th to the 7th decile, about 14% on average of their household budget goes towards food. And the government is moving ahead with banning buy one, get one free meals in October, which has been quite criticised, I'd say, not more outside of public health authorities, but you're essentially taking food off the table for families. And I don't think that's the right thing to be doing, especially given the crisis that we're in at the moment. And also the government has suggested price controls. We've been saying for some time, in fact, we've published a book when we first opened as a think tank in 1977 called 10,000 Years of Price Controls, and they have failed everywhere they've been tried. And the reason that is essentially you're creating shortages, and again, taking food off the table and off the shelves, it's going to affect those poorest in society the most. Because if you've got more money, you can obviously very easily go to other places to buy more food, and so obviously the shortages created are very bad. Finally, and this is kind of again somewhat outside of it, we would like to see thresholds raised for national insurance, and we'd also like to have the personal allowance indexed unfrozen. If you look at when the personal allowance was frozen a few years ago, if you take a kind of CPI inflation and you add that into the model, essentially the personal allowance should go up from about £12,000 up to about £17,000. That's £5,000 saved for households, well, actually individual earners. That would obviously overrun the the single payments that have been put forward by the government during this period. It's also better for productivity in the long run, health of the economy. So I do understand that this is somewhat outside the remit of the committee, but obviously the welfare system we have is very much locked in essentially to this to this wider economic malaise that we're seeing across the country and indeed across the world.
Thank you. Fran?
I think the problem about asking about alternatives is that there's a huge spectrum from the things that we were talking about. So I think Nigel Mills himself actually suggested the 2-month qualifying period rather than 1 month for the cost of living payments, for example, right up to, I thought it was going to be just a whole new benefit system, but actually a whole new tax system as well. So I think it's quite a hard question. It's quite a hard question to answer. So maybe I could just say a few principles, I think, in terms of making the benefit system in particular more sensitive. One would be the family size issue, family size issue, which I think has been revealed by the ad hoc payments as an issue, but was already an issue. So we've had the 2-child limit, we've had the benefit cap, which particularly affects families as well, and we've also had not just the uplift, but also the ad hoc payments, none of those taking account of whether you've got children or not. And I think that's a real issue. It's a direction of our benefit system in which I would not like to see us go any further, and I would like to see us draw back from that. And I think we may be going to talk about international examples. It's not common internationally for that to be happening. The other thing which may be not so obvious, I think, is the household unit, and particularly the household unit for payment for universal credit. And I think Refuge, in its written evidence, talked about this to you in terms of looking at individual payment as well as the household. So I would like to see more emphasis placed on targeting individuals within households and therefore on more individual payments. And of course the non-means tested benefits we've got are largely individual rather than family based now. So I think those are two things that we might look at in terms of more broadly targeting need better than we do at the moment. I mean, there are lots of other things you could say, particularly in terms of the amounts of benefit and the essentials guarantee that was talked about in the previous session.
Thank you. And Richard, anything to add?
I think I'd as you can imagine, probably argue that the Household Support Fund works really well. I think local authorities would welcome an expansion of that, could offer an expansion of that. The problem in the past has been that the department has confirmed household support funds with very little time for local authorities to be able to deliver them, and with more time and planning, local authorities will be able to deliver much better, more targeted schemes that deal with what their local areas require. Certainly for our setup in Leicestershire, the last round of household support fund overspent by £250,000, and the current scheme has spent £250,000 within the first month of opening. So demand is significantly higher than it's ever been, and I think that is just going to continue at the moment. So we definitely think there is scope for an expansion in schemes like that are very locally targeted.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Nigel Mills.
While we're on the household support fund, Richard, I was just been keen to explore how far we could have gone. I mean, if we'd rung you up and said, rather than giving every household on benefits 650 quid, we'd like to give you the equivalent amount of money for Leicestershire. Bearing in mind that probably every household on benefits was going to need some of that money to be able to pay a £1,200 increase in their energy bill. I mean, you'd have just drowned, wouldn't you, trying to somehow get money to thousands and thousands of households in Leicestershire quite quickly with little notice in a crisis. I mean, that's just not a realistic policy option, is it?
I think you're right in that element wouldn't be realistic, and you'd be looking at a different approach rather than that kind of blanket approach that was gone with. So what you would have seen is more fluctuations in the value of grant offered and things like that. So households would have got an appropriate amount offered to them depending on the number of dependent children in the household or something like that. So it would have been a different scheme, I think, if Household Support Fund had done it. Would it have reached the same number of people, not in the timescales with which local authorities were given the money and the guidance by DWP? Do I think local government has the mechanics to be able to offer that? I think yes, with the right amount of planning it could do. But it would have been a different scheme, I think it's fair to say, albeit I think we'd argue one with more nuance that was better tailored.
Could I just add to that? I mean, I absolutely take your point and have said that I think local or locally guided welfare, what is the local welfare assistance scheme, i.e. one-off payments in emergencies, is important. However, it's discretionary, it's cash limited, it's often vouchers rather than money, and it's not as of right. So I think we have to bear all those things in mind. Also, it's not often very much. You didn't actually get very much money. I take your point that you could have got £650, but not to those kinds of numbers. So I do think, and the advice approach, which I think Richard was talking about, the integrated approach of ensuring that you add advice into the package and not just money, is very important, which always means that you do have to have the support of local advice agencies as well as national benefit schemes, clearly. But I just don't think that I think there's a limit to how far we can go down that road.
Can I just build on that, actually, to do with advice and knowledge? I think I completely agree with Fran on that. The government's own messaging around, kind of bills and energy bills have involved a company called USwitch, which is quite a nice, innovative little platform. Quite basically putting into the hands of consumers really good choice about how easy it is to switch between different providers, and how it is also some quite nice little tools online as well to really tailor those suggestions, and definitely utilising people's own wits and knowledge about their own households is really quite important, but also speaking quite extensively to the private sector who, believe it or not, don't want to have their customers freezing or starving, and are happy to work very closely with the government on having solutions for this crisis. So I think it was the late Department Bays that spoke to USwitch, but definitely I would definitely recommend to the government, definitely engaging much more with the private sector on this, because they, as I said, they are still quite concerned about the manner in which a lot of the households around the country and the communities are suffering during this quite terrible crisis.
I'm just keen just to pick back up on Richard's point, because I don't know how many households in Leicestershire qualified for the cost of living payment. It will be tens and tens of thousands, and probably be in the hundreds of thousands, won't it? I mean, it just wouldn't have been realistic to ask every council, would it, to design a scheme, have different criteria, get people to apply and get that money out in what was a pretty fast-moving crisis. I mean, the energy crisis what started last spring, and we were trying to get money out to people to pay the bills over the winter. I mean, it would have taken you longer than that to get enough people to process all the applications, let alone... It just doesn't strike me we could use the Household Support Fund as a way of responding to a crisis where we wanted to get significant amounts of money to millions and millions of households, does it?
No, I suppose if the objective is to get money out to a large number of households as quickly as possible, then no, that wouldn't be the scheme you would use. And I suppose it depends upon what you're setting out as the guiding principles for what you want to achieve. What we believe we've got is a scheme that's tailored, but I think it's absolutely right, as you've said, it's very, if what you value above everything else is getting a set amount of money into someone's bank account as fast as possible, that's a very different approach to, I think, what the Household Support Fund offers. I think going forwards, now we're in a, I think, arguably more stable position with the ability to plan more, accepted. I think it offers a really good model going forwards.
Could I just say, I mean, obviously we need both. We need the money in people's accounts as of right. We need a sensitive emergency system. So we clearly need both. One of the things that your question implied was that it's just council people who are actually administering this. I don't think that's always the case. And certainly in Oxfordshire, it was delegated to the district councils, and then they delegated on to the advice sector to give out some of the money, particularly in terms of nominating for food and fuel vouchers. And the problem about that is that you tend to turn your advice sector into people who have to decide who's deserving of help and who isn't. And actually that isn't a role that they welcome, in my experience. So I think that's one of the things that we should also think about as well. Clearly you need advice as well as the financial support, as we've said. But I think it's difficult for the advice sector to have that role in addition.
Thank you. Richard, can I just ask, I mean, in Leicester, did you use your existing local welfare assistance scheme to put the Household Support Fund through, or was it really a new setup?
We set it as a new scheme.
Right. Okay, thank you. Neil Coyle.
Thanks, Chair. I think you heard the earlier panel's discussion of whether we need a more supportive core benefit system or a top-up system in crisis. And you've already touched on part of this question's main issue. But what are your organisation's views on the preferability of re-uplifting universal credit or continuing the cost of living payments approach?
I'm happy to start on that. I mean, given the fact that the one-off payments were, as we heard earlier, very much gratefully received and did actually make an impact, the uplift would be useful. Of course it would. And I think it is just a matter of fact that more money in people's pockets means they weathered the crisis better. So I think as an institute, I think that is kind of where we'd be facing. I mean, our house view is a negative income tax, and that's something I can expand on in greater detail later on if you wish. But
yes, we'll come to that.
Fantastic, yes. But given the two between one-off payments that are quite distant in between, and a general uptake and flow of money coming into people's pockets over the long run, I think that does make much more sense. And actually, if I may say, I don't think the uplift was enough.
Could I just add to that? I think we need to be really clear about what we mean, because the uplift was only to the standard allowance of universal credit and working tax credit. And people forget about the working tax credit. It was actually for one of the legacy benefits as well. But it was only to the standard allowance of universal credit or the basic rate of working tax credit. So actually, if what you mean is an increase in benefit rates, then I would definitely agree with that, as did the previous panel, I think. And I would agree with that for the non-means tested benefits as well as the means tested. One-off payments were appreciated by some people because they were flexible and because they came all at once and you could pay off a particular... I mean, I know somebody who used it to buy a cooker because their cooker had just broken down, for example. But there should be a system that copes with that, and there should be a system which is generous enough so that people can save up for that kind of emergency anyway.
I'm not sure I've got anything more to add to that one.
I mean, Fran, it sounds like your early criticism of complexifying the system would also allow for the introduction of something like the social fund to cover the emergency cooker replacement or alternative issues, as well as a more generous core system.
Yeah, and I mean the local welfare assistance was meant to be a replacement for parts of the discretionary social fund, although it's a bit different because local authorities don't have the, as I understand it, don't have the capacity to administer loans. So the loans element of the discretionary social fund got dropped by most councils doing local welfare assistance, I think. But yes, absolutely, there has to be a backup emergency benefit payment system, but the most important thing is getting the basic structure of the benefit system right and its amount adequate. And one of the other things we haven't talked about is how you uprate benefits. It was mentioned briefly in the previous panel, and you might have a system of uprating benefits which would use either reference budgets or the costs of living for low-income households, because we know they spend a larger proportion of their budget on these essentials, which have actually been going up enormously, and so on. So there are different methods of uprating benefits and increasing benefits, which might also be helpful.
Just a quick follow-up on this issue of the uplift. Obviously, the government ignored the campaign to try and retain that uplift. And I just wonder if you've seen the end child poverty statistics this week suggest, I think it was a 600,000 increase in children in poverty, including, I think, 7 in 10 children of working parents who are living in poverty. I just wonder whether you've looked at their stats and considered the impact of the reduction of universal credit in the cost of living crisis, and what your views are.
Looking at the statistics, it was quite clear that the uplift wasn't in line with inflation, and it's very concerning to see these large increases in child poverty, especially child poverty, but also poverty across the board. However, we're a free market think tank, so we do take into consideration the fact that money is very, very tight at the moment, especially in the Treasury. There's a lot of borrowing, taxes at an all-time high. So there is some sympathy from our perspective about the not being so happy to uplift the benefits even more, but it's a very, very difficult argument to have when there is, that very long-term future view of the debt is essentially unsustainable, and also there's large amounts of poverty. That debate is, I think, somewhat out of the reach of an economic research think tank, but at the same time, it's, in my personal view, it is a case that I think the government probably should have put some more money aside to uplift those benefits across the board.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Maybe Abrahams.
Sorry, Chair, could I just come in very quickly?
Sorry, Siobhan.
Yes, to Maxwell's point, but to Richard. So I agree. My experience of the Household Support Fund has been successful. I think it enables the targeting of the vulnerable households in a really good way. But if we were going to uplift the benefits, I think the £20 it cost about 9 billion quid in a year, and it perhaps has come down with reduced payments. But is it your experience of dealing with vulnerable households that we could uplift the benefits payments, add the 20 quid back, and then we would still need to be putting money into a vulnerable support scheme, because that is certainly my experience of council. So I think the household support fund is in at least $1 billion, if not $1.5 billion. So are we rolling? We're basically ending up at $10.5 billion, which does become quite unaffordable. Are you sorry, I was being very offly, but are you saying that you wouldn't want to see the loss of the vulnerable support in any circumstances?
I think we would believe, I think local authorities would believe, that the loss of the ability to locally target support to those in need, and particularly short-term support and emergency crisis type support, would be to the detriment of our communities. So I think the idea of sort of saying we wouldn't need something like the household support in a time of a cost of living crisis if benefits had been raised, I don't think that those two would kind of have an equivalent.
That's Maxwell, anyone you had a comment given your across the affordability issue for the Treasury?
Yes, again, as I said earlier, it is a big concern in terms of this, but I think if you are to look at the way in which the money flows from this kind of from these payments down into the economy, they are in many ways recirculated. So there is some down the line gains that Treasury can reclaim through additional spending through indirect taxation, for example. So it's not completely unaffordable, but if I were a special advisor, I would definitely say that we do need to have a proper look at the targeting of this and definitely limit how much we are spending.
Could I just say, I would agree absolutely that we need an increase in benefits, but also a backstop in terms of an emergency support fund.
Thank you very much. Emily Abrams.
I think probably you're not going to have much more to say on this. So given, particularly Fran, what you have said about the need for a structural design, redesign rather of the system and so on, and the points that you've made about increasing simplicity, reducing complexity, ensuring fairness across the plethora of different support payments there is, in an emergency system, what would you do? Start with Fran, and if there are any.
When you say an emergency system, you mean a crisis for the country or people themselves?
So this cost of living payment was introduced in a crisis situation as an emergency. So recognising that needs to be available for us, and we've talked about the local welfare assistance scheme as an example. What would you want to see? What, if you were in charge, what would you have done last autumn?
I think the increase in benefits would have to be a first one. I mean, I think it depends what your aim is, because clearly the government wanted to help all households in some ways, and as I understand it, that isn't the kind of help we're talking about today. So the amount that was taken off everybody's fuel bills, for example, was obviously part of the addressing of the crisis, but I don't think it's something we're looking at today. We're only looking at the cost of living payments, and as I understand it, those are the means-tested ones, and the passported means-tested ones, and the disability payment and the pensioner payment, and I've been concentrating mostly on the means-tested payments, so that's the area I would look at, and clearly you want to do something which is quick and is effective, and effective has lots of different meanings, and can help those people that need it. I mean, I would have tried to do an increase in benefits as an emergency payment, but I can quite see that the ad hoc payment system that the government has got appears to be able to be quicker. And one thing which we haven't emphasised, I think, is that unlike the uplift, the one-off payment does go to people on all the legacy benefits as well, the cost of living payments. So I think we need to stress that it should be people on legacy benefits as well as universal credit who have an increase in
It does seem to be a design issue then, doesn't it? In terms of how the payments are processed, if we wanted to do anything a bit more
Yes, I think part of the problem is that the government has invested in IT, particularly for universal credit, but has somewhat neglected the IT for the legacy benefit systems because they're going to be phased out. So that may be part of the issue that they're talking about.
Okay, thank you. Would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'm happy to add to that. I think
very quickly. If you
yeah, very quickly. I think the universal credit system, I'm very thankful that we had it. I don't think the legacy benefit system would have been able to put up with the pandemic. So I think it would have actually collapsed. It was a bit of a mess. And then obviously with the cost of living support, it was able to basically channel those payments in very quickly. It would be no surprise to anyone on the committee that we'd also have gone for some indirect tax cuts to help basically cut down the actual cost of living on the essentials, on the getting to work, on paying your fuel bill, and a lot of taxes on your energy costs as well. So no surprise there to anyone, but definitely I think we definitely, from our analysis, that would definitely have helped quite a lot.
Okay, thank you. Richard, do you want to add anything?
I'm not sure I've got a huge amount to add to this one, really. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Steve McCabe.
Thank you. I think I want to put this mostly to Fran. Fran, I just wondered if the kind of current sort of cost of living support payments are not that effective, is there a better model that you would recommend?
I think I've probably already answered that in that I think we should be reversing some of the cuts that we've had in the benefit system. We should have more generous benefits, and we should have an emergency payment system to cope with emergencies.
That was it. There isn't anything totally different that you want to...
I mean, I think something like the difference in methods of uprating, I mean, that either you establish a reference budget, which is the kind of thing that the Essentials Guarantee has done, or you actually look at uprating itself in terms of increases with the costs of living that are facing low-income households rather than necessarily just the average CPI. Those kinds of things would also be useful. And there are lots of ways in which I would like to reform the benefit system, including the algorithm for the universal credit calculation, which is very rigid, I think, and holds us back in various different policy directions.
And if I wanted to look at other countries, where would you tell me to look?
Yeah, there are some examples of what's happened in the cost of living crisis from different countries, and the OECD has looked at this for working age people, and I've also got information about different countries from other sources too. It's a very mixed picture. The elements are quite similar with the cost of living package that we've done in the UK. So, for example, Austria has given one-off cost of living payments like we have. But the particularly striking thing, I think, is the number of countries who've given more to children in this cost of living crisis. So, for example, Finland has increased benefits for under 18s by 10%. Canada has given extra for working families. Estonia and Austria actually gave more for larger families than they did for smaller families. Ireland, I think, has doubled child benefit. The Netherlands has given extra cash benefits for families. So that's a really, I think that's a really clear path that we didn't take. Slovakia has indexed benefits with the living costs for low-income households. Belgium has given an increase on top of indexation for the next 4 years. Czechia and Sweden have given increases in help with housing costs. Slovakia has given increased help to carers. Sorry, I'm reading these because I can't remember them all off the top of my head. Germany has given a heating cost allowance. And then there are other things which are not to do with the benefit system, which we're talking about benefits particularly today, but Ireland has given public transport subsidies, which in fact we have as well because we gave the £2 bus ticket. France, as you know, probably has given government discounts on certain goods, certain basic goods. They've also given protection from disconnection in certain months. Luxembourg has an increase in the minimum wage, an increase in tax-free limits. So there's lots of different things.
But the child issue is the thing you would emphasise. I think that's the important one. Okay, thanks. Can I just ask one last thing, Chair? I don't know if you heard the earlier panel, but I was asking about the £150 disability cost of living allowance. And I was struck when I was looking at changes to the Warham Homes discount, which is actually worth about £150 as well. And it's, according to the House of Commons Library, about 300,000 households with people in receipt of a disability benefit are about to lose the Warham Homes discount, which, as I say, is worth about £150 because of the changes, basically because those benefits have been withdrawn from the eligibility criteria. Is that a case of giving with one hand and taking with the other?
I mean, I'm happy to come on this first. I was quite baffled by this, given by the fact that people with disabilities do use quite a lot of energy, more than the average person. So it just, I was quite confused when the government did this, or put it into place basically. So I would suggest reversing that, because it seems a bit mean, and I don't like that.
I mean, I don't have anything to add to that. It's not an area of expertise for me. I don't really have anything to add to that, or what the person from MENCAP said earlier.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Just, Fran, you mentioned Slovakia. They used, did you say that they were uprating benefits in line with the costs for low-income households? Was that a sort of a separate index?
As I understand it, yeah.
Right, okay, that's interesting, yeah. Senator from Thwaite.
Maxwell, can you explain the logic of your suggestion that the cost of living payment be made to any household without a higher level taxpayer, rather than the more focused approach that has been adopted?
So House View has been negative income tax, and that's a fundamental shift to negative income tax across the entire system. So it doesn't just cover the one-off payments. The reason I'll quickly, kind of talk a little bit about what the differences are between UBI, which has been obviously in the news quite a lot recently, negative income tax, and the current system. So I'll start with UBI. UBI is basically saying, here's 100 quid, you give me 50 quid later, right? So it's basically a hard floor on income on households throughout the country, no matter who is eligible. There's no means testing involved. That has been obviously discussed, and it's going to be trialled in a couple of areas in the country over the next few months, and I've seen there's quite a lot of outrage about it. Quite, exactly, quite a lot of outrage. Negative income tax, on the other side, is a completely dynamic model. So it's essentially saying, how do you pay negative tax? You don't. When you have a baseline of £0 income, you receive the maximum allotted. Now, this has been tried in 3 different places in the US to some success. There's some concern, essentially, I believe from the Conservative benches, that it would kind of reduce the incentive to go to work. The actual figures that we find when these experiments were run is that this actually isn't the case. The reason why we like it is because of the cliff edges that essentially it eliminates. It's a completely tapered rate. So essentially, there is no cliff edge anywhere along the system, and by the time you reach the break-even point, you either gain nothing from the state and pay nothing to the state. So essentially, it reduces the complete complexity, even though it's a much more simple model with universal credit at the moment. It reduces the complexity completely and is much more efficient. So let's say, I know recent figures came out that about 5 million people are out of work. If they were to dip their toe into the water, they are quite concerned that they would immediately lose, many of the benefits and payments that they receive from DWP, and that's actually quite a large disincentive to return to work, and it's something that obviously the economy is feeling at the moment. With a negative income tax, this changes completely. So even if you enter a low wage work and the household income is still low, you still receive some benefits, but not as much as those who aren't in work. So it's a gradual encouragement up to moving up the kind of career ladder. And as we see with the cliff edges, as I said earlier to Mr. Linden, essentially, as we saw with the childcare reforms, it's essentially telling people to not go for a pay rise or not progress in their career because they could actually lose more money than if they just chose not to take it. I'd say that's really bad for the economy, and that's why we go for the negative income tax, which is, as I said, a completely dynamic model.
So other than the prejudice that idlers might choose to do nothing, what do you anticipate are going to be the principal obstacles to implementing such a magnificent system?
It's certainly a difficult system. One thing that we've had a look at is kind of the computational power to process the algorithms to deliver this system. It would be quite a change from the way in which any other country does it, as I'm sure we're all aware. But so the computational power is the big first one. The government's recent AI strategy, and I'm sure that's something that we weren't expecting to talk about here, but the AI strategy essentially is going to increase the computational power of the government. And something we really recommend, and I know Mel Strider's definitely a big fan of this, is increasing the tech take-up within the department to essentially automate the state and make things much more smooth and dynamic and working all the time with few troubleshoots. The other issue is, of course, the cost. So, so we published something quite recently with Nikhil Woodruff from the Policy Engine, who essentially found that if one were to abolish the personal allowance and replace it with kind of £33 a week uplift from the current benefit system through a national negative income tax, you could actually reduce the poverty rate across the country overall by 35%. There's quite a large data set he used. So we ran the numbers, and although there's some expense to start off with and to change things over, it'd be a few billion, you would see a long run benefit to everyone in the country.
How many is a few billion?
A few billion. We don't have access to all the data, mainly because the DWP haven't released all the figures yet.
A ballpark?
Ballpark, about 35 billion.
Ooh, that's more than a few.
All relative, yeah.
Fran was coming, I think.
Well, I wasn't aware, well, I was aware we were going to discuss negative income tax, but I wasn't aware this is what this session was about. But because we have raised negative income tax, there are a few questions such as what's the unit? So would this be jointly means tested for everybody? What about individual taxation? What happens to that? What about individually based benefits? Do they all get abolished and merged into negative income tax, which is the only system we'll have? How often are people means tested with the adjustment made to their income? Can it be completely automated or not? There are all sorts of questions about a negative income tax, which, were we here to talk about that, I would very much like to discuss.
I think you've given us a clue.
So the point about individual taxation, would that be lost under your proposal?
Not entirely, no. I think another issue with our current taxation system is, coming back to it again, is the cliff edge problem. And the benefits of the negative income tax is it is an incentive to work, because the way in which the graphs that we drew it's a completely linear graph. If you take a standard angle on the graph where the negative income tax rises is about 45 degrees, and that's kind of it's much more shallow than our current system, which is obviously a higher degree. So generally it would lower taxes, which is better for the economy in our opinion, but it would also provide a much more seamless means of support, somewhat in line with the one-off payments. It gives much more flexibility to families receiving the tax, receiving the negative income tax.
I mean, the other interesting thing is what happens about conditionality, because clearly the current government and previous governments before it have been quite interested in conditionality, and I'm not going to comment on it, but I just wonder whether, like with a universal basic income, the negative income tax also does away with conditionality.
Am I okay to come back on that? Is that okay? There will be some conditionality, and I would also like to comment that it would have to be added to by disability benefit and kind of other areas where people have a greater expense on their households, including with children. So it would require it's not just kind of a simple model that Milton Friedman first put out when he was suggesting it back in the 70s, but it would require a little bit more tailoring, which I'm sure DWP are most capable of.
You referenced a number of studies where counterintuitively it hadn't led to people shirking because they had an income Have we, is there any detail on the analysis of why that may not have been the case?
I can send the studies to the committee afterwards if that they would like for a little bit more further reading. It's a lot of numbers and models and details which I don't think would fit Hansard and would certainly be a little bit easier on the eyes just to read through. So I'm very happy to write into the committee later with those studies.
I'd be most grateful.
We'll study them with great interest. Thank you very much indeed. That concludes the questions we wanted to put to you. We're very grateful to all of you for being willing to give evidence to us this morning and for the very helpful information you provided. Thank you very much. That concludes our meeting. Order.